Do you believe what you read in the media? I'm not talking about Di and Fergie, but about the important stuff, the politics and economics. Has it ever occurred to you it could be a system of propaganda designed to limit how you imagine the world? Well, that's the view of Noam Chomsky, who's been teaching here in Boston for the past 30 years. Described as America's leading dissident, he's based at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where, although it's very cold, it isn't exactly the Gulag archipelago. As a working journalist myself, I've come to talk to Professor Chomsky about bias in the media. Orwell's nightmare, a place where propaganda rules, where thought is controlled.
Comrades, attention! Here is a special bulletin from the Ministry of Peace.
It's now a familiar, if chilling, Cold War fable. Most of us would say it's old hat. But is it?
The thought police are joining you.
The chief job of a newspaper is to inform. To tell people
for decades, the freedoms of thought and expression have been central to Western democracy. The media sees itself as free, fearless, stroppy, and for many in power, the press are too strong. So the idea that Orwell's warning is still relevant may seem bizarre. But not to Noam Chomsky, who thinks the image of a truth-seeking media is a sham. Chomsky has devoted his life to questioning Western state power. Having virtually invented modern linguistics by the age of 30, Chomsky joined the gathering swell of protest in the 60s.
I'm Noam Chomsky. I'm on the faculty at MIT, and I've been getting more and more heavily involved in anti-war activities for the last few years.
Since then, Chomsky has championed a brand of anarchism, becoming deeply hostile to established power and privilege. And in recent years, he's refined what he calls the propaganda model of the media.
Well, on a brighter note, commercial break.
The government has now...
He claims that the mass media brainwash under freedom. Not only do the media systematically suppress and distort, when they do present facts, the context obscures their real meaning.
Stop about every 1,000 miles ain't asking too much, is it? You might wish to stay on and listen.
The invasion of East Timor by the Indonesian army caused indescribable slaughter. Hundreds of thousands died. But it was more or less ignored by the mainstream Western media because, Chomsky argues, we were selling arms to the aggressors. But wars where the West's interests are directly involved get a different treatment. For Chomsky, coverage of the Gulf War was servile. Trivial criticisms were aired, fundamental ones were ignored.
Hello. Andrew Marr. Very nice to see you. Hi.
Naturally, Chomsky has numerous critics.
Which chair has been allotted?
Is the media so influential?
I'm over here.
Okay.
Have dissident views really been excluded in an age of relative media diversity, in the age of the internet?
Right. This is one of...
What about Chomsky's own access? What about this very program?
Okay, Andrew, in your own time.
Professor Chomsky, could we start by listening to you explain what the propaganda model, as you call it, is? For many people, the idea that propaganda is used by democratic rather than merely authoritarian governments will be a strange one.
Well, the term propaganda fell into disfavor at around the Second World War, but in the 1920s and the 1930s, it was commonly used and, in fact, advocated not by leading intellectuals, by the founders of modern political science, by Wilsonian progressives, and, of course, by the public relations industry, as a necessary technique to overcome the danger of democracy. The institutional structure of the media is quite straightforward. We're talking about the United States, but it's not very different elsewhere. There are sectors, but the agenda-setting media, the ones that sort of set the framework for everyone else, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, these are major corporations, parts of even bigger conglomerates, like other corporate institutions, they have a product and a market. Their market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. Their product is relatively privileged audiences, more or less.
So they're selling audiences to
They're
other
selling
corporations.
privileged audience. These are big corporations selling privileged audiences to other corporations. Now the question is, what picture of the world would a rational person expect to come out of this structure? And then we draw some conclusions about what you'd expect, and then we check, and yes, that's the picture of the world that comes out.
And is this anything more than the idea that basically the press is relatively right-wing, with some exceptions, because it's owned by big business, which is a truism, is well known?
Well, I would call the press relatively liberal. Here I agree with the right-wing critics. So especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, which are called, without a trace of irony, the New York Times is called the establishment left in, say, major foreign policy journals. And that's correct, but what's not recognized is that the role of the liberal intellectual establishment is to set very sharp bounds on how far you can go, this far and no further.
Give me some examples of that.
Well, let's take, say, the Vietnam War. Probably the leading critic, and in fact one of the leading dissident intellectuals in the mainstream, is Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, who did finally come around to opposing the Vietnam War about 1969, about a year and a half after corporate America had more or less ordered Washington to call it off. And his picture from then on is that the war, as he put it, began with blundering efforts to do good, but it ended up by 1969 being a disaster and costing us too much.
So what would
that's the criticism.
What would the non-propaganda model have told Americans about the Vietnam War at the same time?
Same thing that the mainstream press was telling them about Afghanistan. The United States invaded first of all, in the 1950s, it set up a standard Latin American-style terror state which had massacred tens of thousands of people, but was unable to control a local uprising, and everyone knows, at least every specialist knows that's what it was. And when Kennedy came in 1961, they had to make a decision because the government was collapsing under local attack, so the U.S. just invaded the country. In 1961, the U.S. Air Force started bombing South Vietnamese civilians, authorized napalm, crop destruction. Then in 1965, February 1965, the next major escalation took place against South Vietnam, not against North Vietnam. That was a sideshow. That's what an honest press would be saying, but you can't find a trace of it.
Now, if the press is a censoring organization, tell me how that works. You're not suggesting that proprietors phone one another up, or that many journalists get their copy spiked, as we say?
It's actually, Orwell, you may recall, has an essay called Literary Censorship in England, which was supposed to be the introduction to Animal Farm, except that it never appeared, in which he points out, look, I'm writing about a totalitarian society, but in free democratic England, it's not all that different. And then he says unpopular ideas can be silenced without any force. And then he gives a two-sentence response, which is not very profound, but captures it. He says two reasons. First, the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in not having certain things appear. But second, the whole educational system, from the beginning on through, just gets you to understand that there are certain things you just don't say. Well, spelling these things out, that's perfectly correct. I mean, the first sentence is what we expand on.
This is what I don't get, because it suggests that, I mean, I'm a journalist, people like me are self-censoring.
No, not self-censoring. There's a filtering system that starts in kindergarten and goes all the way through. And it doesn't work 100%, but it's pretty effective. It selects for obedience and subordination. And especially, I think that's...
So stroppy people won't make it to positions of influence?
Behavior problems, or if you read applications to a graduate school, you see that people will tell you he's not, doesn't get along too well with his colleagues. You know how to interpret those things.
I'm just interested in this because I was brought up, like a lot of people, probably post the Watergate film and so on, to believe that journalism was a crusading craft and that there were a lot of disputatious, stroppy, difficult people in journalism. And I have to say, I think I know some of them.
Well, I know some of the best known investigative reporters in the United States. I won't mention names because I don't want to, whose attitude toward the media is much more cynical than mine. In fact, they regard the media as a sham.